Chapter 4. The Three Figures of the Circuit. Taking TC to stand for the total circulation process, we can depict the three figures as follows. 1. M to C to P to C prime to M prime. 2. P to TC to P. 3. TC to P being C prime. If we take all three forms together, then all the premises of the process appear as its result, as premises produced by the process itself. Each moment appears as a point of departure, of transit, and of return. The total process presents itself as the unity of the process of production and the process of circulation. The production process is the mediator of the circulation process, and vice versa. Common to all three circuits is the valorization of value as the determining purpose, as the driving motive. In Figure 1, this is actually expressed in the form. Form 2 begins with P, the valorization process itself. In Form 3, the circuit begins with the valorized value and closes with the newly valorized value even when the movement is repeated on the same scale. Insofar as C to M is M to C for the buyer, and M to C is C to M for the seller, the circulation of capital simply displays the general metamorphosis of commodities, and the laws developed in connection with this, see Volume 1, Chapter 3, Section 2, governing the amount of money in circulation apply here too. However, if we do not just dwell on this formal aspect of the matter, but consider the real connection between the metamorphoses of the various individual capitals, in fact, the connection between the circuits of individual capitals as partial movements of the reproduction process of the total social capital, then this process cannot be explained in terms of the simple change of form between money and commodity. In a constantly rotating orbit, every point is simultaneously a starting point and a point of return. If we interrupt the rotation, then not every starting point is a point of return. Thus, we have seen that not only does every particular circuit implicitly presuppose the others, but also that the repetition of the circuit in one form includes the motion which have to take place in the other forms of the circuit. Thus, the entire distinction presents itself as merely one of form, a merely subjective distinction that exists only for the observer. Insofar as each of these circuits is considered as a particular form of the movement in which different individual industrial capitals are involved, this difference also exists throughout simply at the individual level. In reality, however, each individual industrial capital is involved in all three at the same time. The three circuits, the forms of reproduction of the three varieties of capital, are continuously executed alongside one another. One part of the capital value, for example, which for the moment functions as commodity capital, is transformed into money capital, while at the same time another part passes out of the production process into circulation as new commodity capital. Thus the circular form of C prime to C prime is constantly described, and the same is the case with the two other forms. The reproduction of the capital in each of its forms, and at each of its stages, is just as continuous as is the metamorphosis of these forms, and their successive passage through these stages. Here, therefore, the entire circuit is the real unity of its three forms. We have assumed in our discussion that the capital value appears either as money capital, productive capital, or commodity capital to the full extent of its magnitude. We thus had the £422, for example, first completely as money capital, then transformed fully into productive capital, finally as commodity capital, yarn to the value of £500, including £78 surplus value. The various stages here constitute an equal number of interruptions. For example, as long as the £422 persists in its money form, i.e. until the purchase M to C factoring into L and MP are completed, the total capital exists and functions simply as money capital. Once it is transformed into productive capital, it functions neither as money capital nor as commodity capital. Its entire circulation process is interrupted, just as on the other hand, its entire production process is interrupted as soon as it functions in one of the two stages of circulation, whether as M or as C prime. Thus the circuit P to P would present itself not only as a periodic renewal of the productive capital, but equally as an interruption in its function, the production process, until the circulation process had been completed. Instead of taking place continuously, production would be pursued only in spasms and be repeated only after periods of time of accidental duration, according to whether the two stages of the circulation process were accomplished quicker or more slowly. This would be the case, for example, with a Chinese handicraftsman who works only for individual clients and whose production process comes to a halt between one order and the next. This is, in fact, true for each individual portion of capital in motion, and all portions of the capital go through this movement in succession. Assume that the 10,000 pounds of yarn is 1 week's output of a spinning mill. This 10,000 pounds of yarn moves in its entirety from the sphere of production into that of circulation. The capital value contained in it must be entirely transformed into money capital, and as long as it persists in the form of money capital, it cannot re-enter the production process. It must first enter circulation and be transformed back into the elements of productive capital, L and MP. The circuit of capital is a constant process of interruption. One stage is left behind, the next stage embarked upon, one form is cast aside, and the capital exists in another. Each of these stages not only conditions the other, but at the same time excludes it. But continuity is the characteristic feature of capitalist production, and is required by its technical basis, even if it is not always completely attainable. Let us see how things proceed in reality. While our 10,000 pounds of yarn steps onto the market as commodity capital and accomplishes its transformation into money, whether as a means of payment, means of purchase, or simply money of account, new cotton, coal, etc. comes into the production process in its place. All this has therefore already been transformed back from both the money form and the commodity form into the form of productive capital, and begins its function as such. Moreover, while the first 10,000 pounds of yarn is being converted into money, a previous 10,000 pounds is already describing the second stage of its circulation, and being transformed back from money into the elements of productive capital. All portions of capital go through the circuit in succession, and at any one time they find themselves in various stages of it. Thus, industrial capital in the continuity of its circuit is simultaneously in all of its stages, and in the various functional forms corresponding to them. While the circuit C' to C' has only just begun for that part which is transformed from commodity capital into money for the first time, for industrial capital, considered as a self-moving totality, the same circuit C' to C' has already been traversed. Money is given out with one hand and taken in with the other. What is at one point the commencement of the circuit M to M' is simultaneously at another point its conclusion. The same applies for the productive capital. The real circuit of industrial capital in its continuity is therefore not only a unified process of circulation and production, but also a unity of all its three circuits. But it can only be such a unity insofar as each different part of the capital runs in succession through the successive phases of the circuit, can pass over from one phase and one functional form into the other. Hence, industrial capital, as the whole of these parts, exists simultaneously in its various phases and functions, and thus describes all three circuits at once. The succession of the various parts is here determined by their coexistence, i.e., by the way in which capital is divided. In the developed factory system, the product is continuously at the various stages of its formation, and in transition from one phase of production to another. Since each individual industrial capital has a definite size, which is dependent on the means of the capitalist and has a definite minimum for each branch of industry, definite numerical ratios must obtain in its division into parts. The size of the capital involved determines the scale of the production process, and this determines the volume of commodity capital and money capital, insofar as these function alongside the production process. The coexistence which determines the continuity of production, however, exists only through the movement in which the portions of capital successively describe the various stages. The coexistence is itself only the result of the succession. If C' to M' comes to a halt in the case of one portion, for example, if the commodity is unsaleable, then the circuit of this part is interrupted, and its replacement by its means of production is not accomplished. The successive parts that emerge from the production process as C' find their change of function barred by their predecessors. If this continues for some time, production is restricted and the whole process brought to a standstill. Every delay in the succession brings the coexistence into disarray. Every delay in one stage causes a greater or lesser delay in the entire circuit, not only that of the portion of the capital that is delayed, but also that of the entire individual capital. The immediate form in which the process presents itself is that of a succession of phases, so that the transition of the capital into a new phase is determined by its abandonment of the previous one. Thus, every particular circuit has one of the functional forms of the capital as its starting point and point of return. On the other hand, the total process is in fact the unity of the three circuits, which are the different forms in which the continuity of the process is expressed. The total circuit presents itself for each functional form of capital as its own specific circuit, and indeed each of these circuits conditions the continuity of the overall process. The circular course of one functional form determines that of the others. It is a necessary condition for the overall production process, in other words, for the social capital, that this is at the same time a process of reproduction, and hence the circuit of each of its moments. Different fractions of the capital successively pass through the different stages and functional forms. Each functional form thus passes through its circuit simultaneously with the others, though it is always a different part of the capital that presents itself in it. A part of the capital exists as commodity capital that is being transformed into money, but this is an ever-changing part and is constantly being reproduced. Another part exists as money capital that is being transformed into productive capital. A third part as productive capital being transformed into commodity capital. The constant presence of all three forms is mediated by the circuit of the total capital through precisely these three phases. As a whole, then, the capital is simultaneously present and spatially coexistent in its various phases, but each part is constantly passing from one phase or functional form into another, and thus functions in all of them in turn. The forms are therefore fluid forms, and their simultaneity is mediated by their succession. Each form both follows and precedes the others, so that the return of one part of the capital to one form is determined by the return of another part to another form. Each part continuously describes its own course, but there is always another part of capital that finds itself in this form, and these particular circuits simply constitute simultaneous and successive moments of the overall process. It is only in the unity of the three circuits that the continuity of the overall process is realized, in place of the interruption we have just delineated. The total social capital always possesses this continuity, and its process always contains the unity of the three circuits. For individual capitals, the continuity of reproduction is at certain points interrupted to a greater or lesser degree. Firstly, the quantities of value are frequently distributed amongst the various stages and functional forms in unequal portions at different times. Secondly, these portions may be differently divided, according to the character of the commodity which has to be produced, thus according to the particular sphere of production in which the capital has been invested. Thirdly, the continuity may be more or less interrupted in branches of production that depend on the season, either as a result of natural conditions, agriculture, fishing for herrings, etc., or as a matter of convention, as is the case with so-called seasonal work, for example. It is in the factory and in mining that the process occurs most regularly and uniformly, but this difference between branches of production does not give rise to any difference in the general forms of the circuit. Capital, as self-valorizing value, does not just comprise class relations, a definite social character that depends on the existence of labor as wage labor. It is a movement, a circulatory process through different stages, which itself, in turn, includes three different forms of the circulatory process. Hence, it can only be grasped as a movement, and not as a static thing. Those who consider the autonomization of value as a mere abstraction forget that the movement of industrial capital is this abstraction in action. Here, value passes through different forms, different movements in which it is both preserved and increases, is valorized. Since we are firstly dealing here simply with the forms of movement, we have not considered the revolutions that the capital value may suffer in its circulatory process. It is clear, however, that despite all revolutions in value, capitalist production can exist and continue to exist only so long as the capital value is valorized, i.e., describes its circuit as value that has become independent, and therefore so long as the revolutions in value are somehow or other mastered and balanced out. The movements of capital appear as actions of the individual industrial capitalist, insofar as he functions as buyer of commodities and labor, seller of commodities, and productive capitalist, and thus mediates the circuit by his own activity. If the social capital value suffers a revolution in value, it can come about that his individual capital succumbs to this and is destroyed, because it cannot meet the conditions of this movement of value. The more acute and frequent these revolutions in value become, the more the movement of independent value, acting with the force of an elemental natural process, prevails over the foresight and calculation of the individual capitalist, the more the course of normal production is subject to abnormal speculation, and the greater becomes the danger to the existence of individual capitals. These periodic revolutions in value thus confirm what they ostensibly refute, the independence which value acquires as capital and which is maintained and intensified through its movement. The sequence of metamorphoses of capital and process implies the continuous comparison of the change in value brought about in the circuit with the original value of the capital. The independence of value in relation to the value-forming power, labor power, is introduced by the act M to L, the purchase of labor power, and is realized during the production process as exploitation of labor power. But this independence does not reappear in the circuit in which money, commodity, and elements of production are only alternating forms of the capital value in process, and in which the past magnitude of the value is compared with the present changed value of the capital. Value, says Bailey, opposing the autonomization of value which characterizes the capitalist mode of production and which he treats as the illusion of certain economists. Value is a relation between contemporary commodities because such only admit of being exchanged with each other. He says this in opposition to the comparison of commodity values at different points in time, a comparison which, if the value of money at each period is taken as fixed, is simply a comparison between the expenditure of labor required in different epochs for the production of the same kind of commodities. This derives from his general misunderstanding, according to which exchange value equals value. The form of value is value itself, thus commodity values cease to be comparable once they no longer actively function as exchange values and cannot actually be exchanged for one another. He does not in the least suspect, therefore, that value functions as capital value or capital only insofar as it remains identical with itself and is compared with itself in the different phases of its circuit, which are in no way contemporary but rather occur in succession. In order to consider the formula of the circuit in its pure state, it is not sufficient to assume that commodities are sold at their values. This must also take place in circumstances that, in other respects too, remain the same. If we take the form P to P, for example, we must disregard all technical revolutions in the production process which may devalue the productive capital of a particular capitalist. We must also disregard any repercussions that a change in the value elements of the productive capital might have on the value of the existing commodity capital, which may rise or fall if there is a stock of this on hand. Let C prime, the 10,000 pounds of yarn, be sold at its value of 500 pounds sterling. 8,440 pounds, equaling 422 pounds sterling, replaces the capital value contained in it. But if the value of cotton, coal, etc. rises, here we disregard mere price fluctuations, then this 422 pounds may not be sufficient to replace completely the elements of the productive capital. Additional money capital is then necessary, i.e., money capital is tied up. Conversely, if these prices fall, money capital is set free. The process takes place quite normally only if value relations remain constant. In practice, it runs its course as long as the disturbances in the repetition of the circuit balance each other out. The greater the disturbances, the greater the money capital that the industrial capitalist must possess in order to ride out the period of readjustment. And since the scale of each individual production process grows with the progress of capitalist production, and with it the minimum size of the capital to be advanced, this circumstance is added to the other circumstances which increasingly turn the function of industrial capitalist into a monopoly of large-scale money capitalists, either individual or associated. We may remark here, in passing, that when there is a change in the value of the elements of production, a distinction arises between the form M to M prime on the one hand and the forms P to P and C prime to C prime on the other. In M to M prime, as the formula for newly invested capital, which first appears as money capital, a fall in the value of the means of production, for example raw materials, ancillaries, etc., means that only a smaller outlay of money capital than previously is required in order to open a business of a particular size, since, given that the level of the productive forces remains the same, the scale of the production process depends only on the volume and scale of the means of production that a given quantity of labor power can cope with, and not on the value of those means of production, or on that of the labor power. The latter simply has an effect on the magnitude of the valorization. Conversely, if there is an increase in the value of the elements of production of the commodities which form the elements of productive capital, then more money capital is necessary in order to found a business of a given size. In both cases, it is only the amount of the money capital to be newly invested that is affected. In the first case, some money capital becomes superfluous. In the second case, more money capital is tied up, provided that the rate of increase of a new individual industrial capital proceeds as is usual in a given branch of production. The circuits P to P and C prime to C prime behave in the same way as M to M prime only insofar as the movements of P and C prime is at the same time accumulation, i.e. insofar as excess small m, money, is transformed into money capital. Otherwise, they are affected differently from M to M prime by a change in the value of the elements of productive capital. Here, we once again disregard the impact a change in value of this kind has on the components which are already involved in the production process. Here it is not the original outlay that is directly affected, but rather an industrial capital involved not in its first circuit, but in its process of reproduction, i.e. C prime to C factoring into L and MP, the conversion of commodity capital back into its elements of production, insofar as these consist of commodities. With a fall in value, or price, three cases are possible. First, the reproduction process may be continued on the same scale, in which case a part of the former money capital is set free, and money capital is stored up, though neither real accumulation, production on an expanded scale, nor the preliminary and accompanying transformation of small m, surplus value, into an accumulation fund has taken place. Second, the reproduction process may be expanded to a larger scale than would have otherwise been the case if the technical proportions permit this. Or third, a larger reserve of raw materials, etc. may be built up. The opposite happens with a rise in the value of the replacement elements of commodity capital. Reproduction then no longer takes place on its normal scale. For example, working hours may be cut, or additional money capital has to be injected in order to continue the former scale of reproduction. Money capital is tied up. Or finally, the monetary accumulation fund, where there is one, has to serve in whole or in part for pursuing the reproduction process on its old scale, instead of expanding it. This also involves the tying up of money capital, although here the additional money capital does not come from an external source, from the money market, but rather from the resources of the industrial capitalist himself. But there can be modifying circumstances to P and C' to C'. If our cotton spinner has a large reserve of raw cotton, for example, i.e. a large part of his productive capital is in the form of a cotton stock, then a part of his productive capital will be devalued by a fall in the cotton prices. If these rise, then this part of his productive capital conversely rises in value. On the other hand, if he has large quantities tied up in the form of commodity capital, for example in cotton yarn, then a fall in cotton prices will devalue a part of his commodity capital and thus a part of his overall capital in the circuit, conversely with a rise in cotton prices. In the process C' to M to C, factoring into L and MP finally, if C' to M, the realization of commodity capital, has taken place before the change in value of the elements of C, then the capital is affected only in the way considered in the first case, i.e. in the second act of circulation M to C factoring into L and MP. But if the change in value occurs before the completion of C' to M, then, with other circumstances remaining the same, the fall in the price of cotton leads to a corresponding fall in the price of yarn, and a rise in the price of cotton to a rise in the price of yarn. The effect on the various individual capitals invested in the same branch of production can be very different according to the different circumstances in which they are found. Money capital may also be set free or tied up as the result of differences in the duration of the circulation process, i.e. in the speed of circulation. This, however, belongs to the discussion of turnover. What interests us here is simply the real distinction which emerges between M to M' and the two other forms of the circuit with respect to the changes in value of the elements of productive capital. In the section of circulation M to C factoring into L and MP, in the epoch when the capitalist mode of production is already developed and hence dominant, a large part of the commodities which the means of production, MP, consist are themselves the functioning commodity capital of others. From the standpoint of the seller, therefore, what takes place is C' to M', the transformation of commodity capital into money capital. But this does not hold good absolutely. On the contrary, within its circulation process, in which industrial capital functions either as money or as commodity, the circuit of industrial capital, whether in the form of money capital or commodity capital, cuts across the commodity circulation of the most varied modes of social production, insofar as this commodity circulation simultaneously reflects commodity production. Whether the commodities are the product of production based on slavery, the product of peasants, of a community, of state production, or of half-savage hunting peoples, etc., as commodities and money, they confront the money and commodities in which the industrial capital presents itself, and enter both into the latter's own circuit and into that of the surplus value borne by the commodity capital, insofar as the latter is spent as revenue, i.e. in both branches of the circulation of commodity capital. The character of the production process from which they derive is immaterial. They function on the market as commodities, and as commodities, they enter both the circuit of industrial capital and the circulation of the surplus value borne by it. Thus, the circulation process of industrial capital is characterized by the many-sided character of its origins, and the existence of the market as a world market. What holds for foreign commodities holds also for foreign money, as commodity capital functions in relation to money simply as commodity, so this money functions towards commodity capital simply as money. The money functions here as world money. Now, however, there are two further points to be made. Firstly, as soon as the act M to MP is completed, the commodities, MP, cease to be commodities and become one of the modes of existence of industrial capital in its functional form P, productive capital. Their provenance is therefore obliterated. They now exist simply as forms of existence of industrial capital and are incorporated into it. Yet it remains the case that their replacement requires their reproduction, and to this extent the capitalist mode of production is conditioned by modes of production lying outside its own stage of development. Its tendency, however, is to transform all possible production into commodity production. The main means by which it does this is precisely by drawing this production into its circulation process, and developed commodity production is itself capitalist commodity production. The intervention of industrial capital everywhere promotes this transformation, and with it too the transformation of all immediate producers into wage laborers. Secondly, whatever the origin of the commodities that go into the circulation process of industrial capital, and these include the necessary means of subsistence into which variable capital is transformed after being paid to the workers so that they can reproduce their labor power, whatever therefore may be the social form or the production process from which these commodities derive, they confront industrial capital straight away in its form of commodity capital, they themselves having the form of commodity dealing or merchant's capital, and this, by its very nature, embraces commodities from all modes of production. As the capitalist mode of production presupposes production on a large scale, so it also necessarily presupposes large-scale sale to the merchant, not to the individual consumer. Insofar as this consumer is himself a productive consumer, i.e. an industrial capitalist, i.e. insofar as an industrial capital in one branch of production supplies means of production to another branch, there is also direct sale by one industrial capitalist to several others, in the form of orders, etc. Each industrial capitalist is a direct seller insofar as he is himself his own merchant, which he is moreover also when he sells to a merchant. Commodity trade is presupposed, as a function of merchant's capital, and this develops ever further with the development of capitalist production. Thus, we occasionally take its existence for granted in illustrating particular aspects of the capitalist circulation process. But in this general analysis, we assume direct sale without the intervention of the merchant, since this intervention conceals various moments of the movement. We may quote Sismondi, who presents the matter rather naively. Quote, "Commerce employs a considerable capital, and this appears at first glance not to form part of that whose course we have charted. The value of the cloth accumulated in the stores of the draper seems at first to be completely different from the part of the year's production that the rich man gives to the poor man as a wage to have him work for him. But this capital has simply replaced that of which we have been speaking. In order to grasp clearly the progress of wealth, we started with its creation, and we have followed it through to its consumption. The capital employed in the manufacture of cloth, for example, we regarded as remaining constant. Exchanged against the revenue of the consumer, it divided into only two parts. One of these served as revenue for the manufacturer, in the form of profit. The other served as revenue for the workers in the form of wages, while they were manufacturing more cloth. But it was soon found to be to everyone's advantage for the various parts of this capital to replace one another, so that if 100,000 crowns was sufficient for the whole circulation between the manufacturer and the consumer, this 100,000 crowns would be shared equally between the manufacturer, the wholesale merchant, and the retailer. The first of these, who receives only a third of the total, does the same work as he did when he received the whole lot, because the moment its manufacture is completed, he finds the merchant to buy it much sooner than he would have found the consumer. The wholesaler's capital, for its part, is replaced by that of the retailer much sooner. The difference between the sums advanced in wages and the purchase price for the final consumer forms the profit on the capitals. It is divided between the manufacturer, the wholesaler, and the retailer, after they have divided their functions between them, and the task accomplished is the same, even though it has employed 3 persons and 3 fractions of capital in place of 1. All these, the merchants, indirectly participated in production, for as the aim of production is consumption, it cannot be considered accomplished until it has placed the object produced at the disposal of the consumer." End quote. In considering the general forms of the circuit, and throughout this second volume in general, we take money to be metal money, excluding symbolic money, mere tokens of value which are specific to particular countries, as well as credit money, which we have not yet developed. Firstly, this is the course taken by history. Credit money played no role, or at least not a significant one, in the early period of capitalist production. Secondly, the necessity of this course can be proved theoretically, insofar as everything critical that has so far been said about the circulation of credit money by Tuke and others compelled them time and again to look back at how the matter would present itself on the basis of mere metallic circulation. It should not be forgotten, however, that metallic money cannot only function as means of purchase, but also as means of payment. For the sake of simplification, we generally take it, in this second volume, only in the first functional form. The circulation process of industrial capital, which forms only one part of its individual circuit, is determined, insofar as it represents only a series of acts within the general commodity circulation, by the general laws that have already been developed. See Volume 1, Chapter 3. The same quantity of money, for example £500, puts correspondingly more industrial capitals into circulation, i.e., individual capitals in their form as commodity capitals. The greater the velocity of circulation of the money, thus the faster each individual capital passes through its series of metamorphoses into commodities and money. Capital of the same value accordingly requires less money for its circulation. The more the money functions as a means of payment, for example, the more that it is only balances that have to be settled when a commodity capital is replaced by its means of production, and the shorter the periods of payment, for example, in the payment of wages. On the other hand, assuming that the velocity of circulation and all other circumstances remain the same, the amount of money needed to circulate as money capital is determined by the sum of the prices of the commodities, price multiplied by the quantity of commodities, or alternatively, given the quantity and values of the commodities by the value of the money itself. But the laws of general commodity circulation apply only insofar as the circulation process of capital is a series of simple acts of circulation, and not insofar as the latter form functionally specific sections of the circuits of individual industrial capitals. In order to make this clear, it is best to consider the circulation process in its uninterrupted interconnection, as it appears in the two forms, Form 2, P to C prime, to track 1 being C to M to C factoring into L and MP, to P being P prime, and track 2 being to M prime, and track 3 being to small c to small m to small c. And Form 3, C prime to track 1 being C to M to C factoring into L and MP, to P and C prime, to track 2 being M prime, and track 3 being small c to small m to small c. As a series of acts of circulation in general, the circulation process, whether as C to M to C or as M to C to M, simply presents two opposing series of commodity metamorphoses, each individual metamorphosis including the opposite metamorphosis on the part of the other person's commodity or money that confronts it. C to M on the part of the commodity possessor is M to C on the part of the purchaser. The first metamorphosis of the commodity in C to M is the second metamorphosis of the commodity which steps forth as M. Conversely with M to C. What was previously demonstrated concerning the intertwining of the metamorphoses of a commodity at one stage with those of another commodity at another stage therefore holds good for the circulation of capital, insofar as the capitalist is buyer and seller of commodities, and his capital accordingly functions as money towards others' commodities, or as a commodity towards others' money. This intertwining, however, is not by this token alone an entwining of the metamorphoses of capitals. Firstly, M to C, being MP, as we have seen, can depict an entwining of the metamorphoses of various individual capitals. The commodity capital of the cotton spinner, yarn for example, is in part replaced by coal. A part of his capital exists in the money form and is converted from this into the commodity form, while the capital of the mine owner exists in the commodity form and is therefore converted into the money form. The same act of circulation here represents opposite metamorphoses on the part of two industrial capitals, which belong to different branches of production, i.e. an entwining of the series of metamorphoses of these capitals. As we have seen, however, the MP into which M is converted need not be commodity capital in the categorical sense, i.e. need not be a functional form of industrial capital produced by a capitalist. It is always M to C on the one hand and C to M on the other, but not always an entwining of metamorphoses of capital. Furthermore, M to L, the acquisition of labor power, is never an entwining of capital metamorphoses, for while labor power is certainly a commodity for the worker, it becomes capital only when it is sold to the capitalist. In the process C prime to M prime, on the other hand, M prime does not need to be converted commodity capital. It can be the expression in money of the commodity labor power, i.e. wages, or of a product produced by an independent worker, a slave, a serf, or a community. Secondly, it is by no means always the case that the functionally determined role played by every metamorphosis that takes place within the circulation process of an individual capital represents the corresponding opposite metamorphosis in the circuit of the other capital, particularly if we assume that the whole of production for the world market is pursued on a capitalist basis. In the circuit P to P, for example, the M prime that turns C prime into cash may be, on the side of the buyer, simply the monetary expression of his surplus value, if the commodity is an article of consumption. Alternatively, in M' to C', factoring into L and MP, i.e., where accumulated capital is involved, it may be for the buyer of MP simply a replacement for his capital advance, or it may not re-enter his capital circulation at all, particularly if this branches off into expenditure of revenue. The way in which the various components of the total social capital, of which the individual capitals are only independently functioning components, alternately replace one another in the circulation process, both with respect to capital and to surplus value, is thus not the result of the simple intertwining of the metamorphoses that occurs in commodity circulation, and which the acts of capital circulation have in common with all other processes of commodity circulation, but rather requires a different mode of investigation. Up till now, mere phrases have been taken as sufficient in this respect, although when these are analyzed more closely, they contain nothing more than indefinite notions, simply borrowed from the intertwining of metamorphoses that is common to all commodity circulation. One of the most obvious peculiarities of the circuit of industrial capital, and thus of capitalist production, is the situation that on the one hand, the elements from which productive capital is formed stem from the commodity market, and must be continually renewed from it, bought as commodities, and on the other hand, the product of the labor process emerges from it as a commodity, and must constantly be sold anew as a commodity. A modern farmer in the lowlands of Scotland might, for example, be contrasted with an old-fashioned small peasant on the continent. The former sells his entire product and thus has to replace all its elements, even the seed corn, on the market, while the latter consumes the greater part of his product directly, buys and sells as little as possible, and as far as possible produces his tools, clothing, etc. himself. Natural economy, money economy, and credit economy have for this reason been counterposed as the three characteristic economic forms of motion of social production. Firstly, these three forms do not represent phases of development of the same status. The so-called credit economy is itself only a form of the money economy, insofar as both terms express functions or modes of commerce between the producers themselves. In developed capitalist production, the money economy simply appears as the basis of the credit economy. Thus, money economy and credit economy merely correspond to different stages of development of capitalist production. They are in no way different independent forms of commerce as opposed to natural economy. It would be just as valid to counterpose the very varied forms of natural economy as equal in status to the other two. Secondly, what is emphasized in the categories money economy and credit economy, and stressed as the distinctive feature, is actually not the economy proper, i.e., the production process itself, but rather the mode of commerce between the various agents of production, or producers, that corresponds to the economy. And so this should also be done in the case of the first category. Instead of natural economy, we would then have barter economy. A completely enclosed natural economy, such as the Inca state of Peru, would fall into none of these categories. Thirdly, money economy is common to all commodity production, and the product appears as a commodity in the most diverse organisms of social production. Thus, it would simply be the scale on which the product was produced as an article of trade, as a commodity, and thus also the extent to which its own formative elements must again enter the commodity from which it derives as articles of trade, as commodities, which would characterize capitalist production. In point of fact, capitalist production is commodity production as the general form of production, but it is only so and becomes ever more so in its development, because labor itself here appears as a commodity, because the worker sells his labor, i.e. the function of his labor power, and moreover, as we have assumed, at a value determined by the cost of its reproduction. The producer becomes an industrial capitalist to the same extent that labor becomes wage labor. Hence, capitalist production, and thus also commodity production, appears in its full extent only when the direct agricultural producer is also a wage laborer. In the relation between capitalist and wage laborer, the money relation, the relation of buyer and seller, becomes a relation inherent in the production itself. But this relation rests fundamentally on the social character of production, not on the mode of commerce. The latter rather derives from the former. It is typical of the bourgeois horizon, moreover, where business deals fill the whole of people's minds, to see the foundation of the mode of production in the mode of commerce corresponding to it, rather than the other way around. The capitalist casts less value into circulation in the form of money than he draws out of it, because he casts in more value in the form of commodities than he has extracted in the form of commodities. Insofar as he functions merely as the personification of capital, As industrial capitalist, his supply of commodity value is always greater than his demand for it. If his supply and demand matched one another in this respect, this would be equivalent to the non-valorization of his capital. It would not have functioned as productive capital. Productive capital would have been transformed into commodity capital that had not been impregnated with surplus value. It would not have extracted from labor power during the production process any surplus value in the commodity form, and thus not functioned as capital at all. The capitalist must indeed sell dearer than he has bought, but he manages to do this only because the capitalist production process enables him to transform the cheaper, because less valuable, commodities that he has bought into more valuable and hence dearer ones. He sells dearer not because he sells above the value of his commodities, but because he sells commodities of a value greater than the sum of values of the ingredients required to produce them. The greater the difference between the capitalist's supply and his demand, i.e., the greater the additional commodity value that he supplies over the commodity value that he demands, the greater the rate at which he valorizes his capital. His goal is not simply to cover his demand with his supply, but to have the greatest possible excess of supply over demand. What is true for the individual capitalist is true for the capitalist class. Insofar as the capitalist simply personifies industrial capital, his own demand consists simply in the demand for means of production and labor power. His demand for MP is smaller in value terms than the capital he has advanced. He buys means of production to a smaller value than the value of his capital, and hence to a still smaller value than that of the commodity capital he supplies. As far as his demand for labor power is concerned, it is determined in its value by the ratio between his variable capital and his total capital, i.e. V to C. In capitalist production, therefore, this demand grows at a smaller rate than his demand for means of production. The capitalist buys more of MP than of L, and to a steadily increasing extent. Insofar as the worker converts his wages almost wholly into means of subsistence, and by far the greater part into necessities, the capitalist's demand for labor power is indirectly also a demand for the means of consumption that enter into the consumption of the working class. But this demand equals V, and not an atom more. If the worker saves something out of his wages, we necessarily leave the matter of credit out of consideration here, this means that he transforms a part of his wage into a hoard, and to this extent does not appear as a customer. The maximum limit of the capitalist demand is C equaling small c plus V. But his supply is small c plus V plus S. Thus, if the composition of his commodity capital is 80 parts small c, 20 parts V, and 20 parts S, then his demand is 80 parts small c plus 20 parts V, a value 1/5 smaller than his supply. The greater the percentage of S produced, the rate of profit, the smaller his demand in relation to his supply. Although, as production advances, the capitalist's demand for labor power, and hence indirectly for necessary means of subsistence, becomes progressively smaller than his demand for means of production. It should not be forgotten that his demand for MP is always smaller than his capital, considering this day by day. His demand for means of production must thus always be smaller in value than the commodity product of the capitalist who works with the same capital and under otherwise similar conditions, and supplies him with these means of production. That many capitalists are involved here, and not just one, in no way affects the matter. Assume that his capital is £1,000, the constant part of this being £800, then his demand on all of these capitalists is £800. Together, they supply for each £1,000, no matter how much of this falls to each one of them and what portion this may constitute in his total capital. Assuming the same rate of profit, the means of production to a value of £1,200. Thus, his demand only covers 2/3 of their supply, while his own total demand is only 4/5 of his own supply, considered in value terms. We still have to investigate the question of turnover, for the time being only in passing. Assuming that his total social capital is £5,000, of which £4,000 is fixed and £1,000 circulating, this 1,000 is equal to 800 parts small c and 200 parts V, according to the above assumption. His circulating capital must turn over 5 times in the year in order for his total capital to turn over once. His commodity product is then £6,000, i.e. £1,000 greater than the capital he advanced, which once again gives the same ratio of surplus value as above. 5,000 parts C to 1,000 parts S, equaling 100 parts small c plus V to 20 parts S. Thus, this turnover in no way alters the ratio of his total demand to his total supply, the former remaining 1/5 smaller than the latter. Let us assume that his fixed capital has to be renewed in 10 years. Each year, then, he amortizes 1/10, equaling £400. After the first year, he has a value of £3,600 in fixed capital and £400 in money. Insofar as repairs are necessary, and these do not exceed the average amount, they are simply capital that is invested at a later date. We can consider the matter as if he had allowed for all the repair costs when he assessed the value of his invested capital, insofar as this enters into the annual commodity product, so that these are included in the 1/10 amortization. If his repair needs are lower than average, this is simply a bonus for him, just as it is to his disadvantage if they are higher. In any case, although, on the assumption that his total capital turns over once in the year, his annual demand remains £5,000, the same as the original capital value he advanced, it increases with respect to the circulating part of the capital, while it steadily declines with respect to the fixed part. We now come to reproduction. Assume that the capitalist consumes the entire surplus value m, and reconverts only the original capital sum C into productive capital. The capitalist's demand is now equal in value to his supply, but this is not so in respect to the movement of his capital. As capitalist, he exerts a demand only on the basis of 4/5 of his supply, in value terms. The remaining fifth he consumes as non-capitalist, not in his function as a capitalist, but for his private requirements or pleasures. His account, reckoned in percentages, is then his demand as a capitalist being 100, supply 120, his demand as a man of the world being 20, the total demand equaling 120 out of a supply of 120. This assumption is equivalent to assuming the non-existence of capitalist production, and therefore the non-existence of the industrial capitalist himself. For capitalism is already essentially abolished once we assume that it is enjoyment that is the driving motive and not enrichment itself. It is moreover also technically impossible. The capitalist must not only form a reserve capital to guard against price fluctuations, and in order to be able to await the most favorable conjunctures for buying and selling, he must accumulate capital in order to extend production and incorporate technical advances into his productive organism. In order to accumulate capital, he must first withdraw from circulation a part of the surplus value that he obtained from it, and let it grow in the form of a hoard until it has assumed the requisite dimensions for an extension of his old business or the opening of a new line. As long as the hoarding continues, the capitalist's demand is not increased. The money is immobilized and does not withdraw from the commodity market an equivalent in commodities for the money equivalent that it is withdrawn for commodities supplied. We have ignored credit here, and it pertains to credit if the capitalist deposits the money that he accumulates in a bank, for example, on current account bearing interest.